The following is a JourneyWise Network production.
Hey friends, welcome to JourneyWise podcast. I'm Shane Stanford.
I'm Ronnie Kent.
I'm James Kent.
And we are so glad to welcome you to this conversation. In this season of JourneyWise, we're talking about practical intersections of faith and health and wellness. And what do you do whenever you enter those intersections so that you can have the most productive and healthiest way of facing what comes next? And I can't think of an intersection that is more disturbing that I've dealt with as a pastor with families and individuals than someone receiving a diagnosis, either chronic or even a terminal diagnosis, and how that doesn't just affect the person receiving the diagnosis, but the ripple effect can go out generations, particularly if it's a child that is diagnosed, or it's an older parent, but yet you have other children and siblings and so forth. And so I wanted us to just talk today for a little bit about what do you do with a diagnosis? And I've had a few of those. I've had not just one diagnosis. I've had, I think, 5 diagnoses. No, I mean, you can laugh. It's all right. I'm at peace with it. So, but you were there for most of those diagnoses, if not all of them, except for the hemophilia. And James, of course, I have great respect for his work as a counselor. And so, you know, when I thought about what this meant for me, the people around me always helped bring it into certain categories. And there were 4 categories. I borrowed language for 2 of them that you've been using with your granddaughter lately. The first is faith, and then finding the facts, and then the feelings, and then the focus. And it's important that they go in that order, because a lot of times we get them out of order. Feeling, would you say feeling comes up number one?
Absolutely.
Why is feeling usually the first one that comes up?
Well, I think, and I don't think people should feel shame or should be embarrassed for that. It's the way God made us. But he did say, guard your heart, guard your emotions, because, you know, out of it comes everything it can be. But I think that's a natural reaction that we have to learn how to process that to move us then into faith first.
Yeah. I remember having much more of a visceral response to my heart surgery and to that diagnosis than I did to my HIV. In fact, you're the one that gave me the news about my HIV, and I think I left there and went to go play golf.
Yeah,
so obviously it didn't bother me that much.
You were fairly casual about it, much more casual than I was.
But I think part of that is because I had not really taken a lot of time with the facts. I didn't understand as much about what was happening with HIV as I knew when everybody was running around very concerned about the heart situation. Yeah. It was important that I had facts for both to deal with them both, but it was interesting that because I didn't do that, how my feelings were very different and also charged in different ways. So I think feeling is such an important part, but before that, the first one has to be, I think, faith, just because you have to know what you believe about what might happen and what will happen. And for so many people, that really is where they would come to me in my career as a pastor, is wanting to know. The first question, I bet you can ask the question yourself, is where is God in all this? Why is this happening to me? Have either one of you dealt with that in your practices?
Every day, and I know he has people come. I'm gonna let him go first because I'm the one that usually gives it, and they go to the counselor to get so I'll let him do the important stuff, and then I'll tell you from my perspective.
Sure.
Well, I mean, I think there's different approaches to that response, and some of it depends on the individual, maybe how intellectual the person is versus maybe looking at it from a more practical or even a feeling state. But I mean, there's the answer of the fall. I mean, these things happen because we live in a fallen world. And we're in this state because of original sin. And the good news is Jesus came to redeem all of it. Now, that might not help you feel better in the moment. And so to me, a lot of what I would encourage people to do is really just talk about what they were feeling. Sometimes processing it out loud makes a really big difference. And as a therapist, I mean, that was probably 90% or more of my job, was give them a safe place to talk, open up, and explore. They may not know exactly how they're feeling. They may be overwhelmed with all the thoughts, Maybe someone gets a diagnosis of a terminal illness and they've got young kids and a wife, or business they've just started, or aging parents, or, I mean, it could be or, and in that moment, you're thinking, I'm about to die. And so there's no time. I don't know how to do it. And it seems impossible. And these things seem outside of my control. And so I think it's about as overwhelming as a situation can be. So just helping them process through what they're feeling in the moment, kind of take that 2 steps back. And to me, just starting with faith means that in those situations, hopefully through practice, my first response is simply, whether spoken or thought, Jesus. And a big question mark. Jesus followed by a big question mark. And then I just process from there. But it can be very overwhelming in many ways.
Well, I think I told you earlier that I used to have a great fear of flying, and I went to your dad, and this was the advice he gave me. He said, well, you're either going to end up where you're flying to, or you're going to be in heaven. And I used to think, that is not helpful to me. But yet, as I got older, it became, yes, that's exactly right. I can be comforted by that. I remember my wife and I went on a trip, flew to Washington, D.C., and a lot of bad weather. And for the day coming back, which was several days later, it was going to be a lot of bad weather. I wanted to put us on 2 different flights because it hit me while I was up there, because we had children then.
Oh, yeah.
And so my brain was running all around it. And finally, my wife said, where's faith in all of this? And I went, well, I don't know, but when I find it, I'll tell you. But
not here. It's not here.
Not here right now. But if you approach life like that every day, you'd never leave the house.
No, well,
you'd never leave the house.
Called agoraphobia.
Yes, yeah, exactly. Yeah,
they put a word on it.
Yeah, that's a big word.
I can't pronounce it. But it's in your daily practice that you prepare yourself for those diagnoses, and so to some people that are struggling to where is God in this, they may not have a relationship with God. And so really the first question is, well, what I generally say is, let me tell you what happened to me when I was 8 years old. And I tell them how what I'm basing my personal relationship with Jesus on it, and that is to receive what he did for me in the kitchen at Quinton, Mississippi, that my mama told me about, Jesus offered to me. Tell me about your experience. And they if they don't have one, they can't possibly feel like God is their father, a loving father, if they don't know him as such. But if they do, well, tell me about your experience with God every day. Well, I don't really, how about church? Well, I go to church occasionally. You can't take them to James 1.
Yeah, sure.
You cannot take them to me, you can start with, and this is what I tell people, my first thing I say to some people that are in one of those downward spirals emotionally when something bad has happened, be that a diagnosis for them or for a family member or a tremendous loss, I tell them, hold on to God. That's the only thing I tell them. Just hold on to God. Because the great news is, when they reach out to him, he's there.
Yeah.
And he, the God of all comfort, 2 Corinthians, the 1st chapter says, he is there and aware of your distress. And he wants to bring comfort into your faith, which brings comfort into your life. And so I think we can complicate it with, consider it all joy, my brothers. They're not ready for that.
Yeah.
Down the road they will be, and they can have that faith experience with him then, but at first you just hold on to who is reaching out to you.
So what would the beginning steps of that look like to you if you were helping someone just, okay, I don't really know how to hold on to him, but what do I do to hold on, to try to hold on to him?
Well, I mean, I think a practical plan, and that is, you have to literally involve him in every area of your life that you can, as often as you can. I mean, so what are you doing in terms of reading scripture? What is your prayer life?
Psalms in particular. Psalms in particular.
Yeah.
Life along the way in particular.
Life along the way.
Would be a great thing to do. But and then I think regularly meeting with that person, checking in. As a therapist, I was sort of limited, but there were times where I would meet with people twice a week, just because there was maybe it was such an overwhelming situation, and they really needed somebody checking in very frequently. But the plan, I'd say, you need to collaboratively come up with the plan.
Yeah.
And for people who don't know as much, a lot of it may be asking questions like, well, do you have a Bible? Do you read the Bible? What translation have you been reading? They may not know what translation to use, and they've tried to read the King James, and they're like, well, those who know more, get you an NIV.
Or a message.
Yeah. And so I think that's super practical, probably ABC, and then with many indentions, breaking it down to be as particular.
And get somebody to walk with you.
Yeah.
If at all possible. We're relational people, beings, and we're relationally with God, but boy, sometimes it is hard to hold on to God.
Well, and I was just about to mention that. I don't think that I could have made it all these years without people that God had angled into my path to be able to walk at certain stages and times, because there were just things that I wasn't going to be able to do well or wouldn't listen, well enough unless it was this particular person in my life. And so I think that is very important.
I've got great news for you guys. One of the people that does our podcast with my son James is Shane Stanford. He's written a book, and it's a book about his life to make the Beatitudes be very practical in how you look at life. You really need to read this book, because not only will it change the way you live life, but it will also change the way that you help other people live life. JourneyWise. Get it and read it. It's going to be great.
So let's talk about, we've talked about feelings a little bit, we've talked about faith. Let's talk about fact. Why is it important, as you have told Mary Brooke many times, to know the facts first, say the facts first?
Because feelings lie. Feelings lie. Your feelings will almost always take you down the wrong road. And it is a slick road.
Yes.
I mean, even when you try to stop going down that negative road, you keep sliding down that road because your mind is caught in that negativity that Satan wants you. What did Jesus himself say Satan's purpose is? Steal, kill, and destroy. Those are not casual things.
Okay.
And so Satan wants you to, so what God says, I'm going to allow this to occur in your life so that you can step toward me. Okay? You can step into my arms. You can step into my presence. You can step into not the peace of God, but the God of peace steps into you. Now, what does Satan do? Makes a step away, back to the garden where God came looking, wanted them to step into him. What did Adam and Eve? They hid. They ran away from God. And so anything that Satan can do to disrupt that most important thing, the relationship, that's why our emotions start taking us down that feelings path that causes us to do that. And if you recognize that, if you're mature enough to recognize it, you go, that's just Satan again.
Yeah.
I refuse to let that. I know God has allowed this in my life. Then you can move toward James 1, that I'll be perfect, complete, lacking in nothing. You can move toward that, but you have to recognize it first, and that's why I think the daily preparation, having somebody in your life that helps you say, whoop, let's don't go down that road, okay? Let's move back toward the facts of now. Let's look at what was actually said to you. I've had so many people walk away from my office, and because I was able to take care of a lot of friends and their children, I would have been through about the third or fourth person get back to what I said to them in the office, which was totally different than what actually came out of my mouth.
Yes.
And it was 100% always completely, totally worse than what I said. So I know for a fact that your feelings are going to take you the wrong way. So that's why the facts. That's why with Mary Brooke, I'll see her, somebody will make a statement, I'll see her kind of either that or kind of the crumbler, and I'll be watching her to catch her eyes, and so she'll catch her eyes and she'll look at me and go, fact, not feeling. Fact, not feeling.
Well, and I would just add that we're really hardwired to respond sort of in a fear-based mentality.
Okay, yeah,
It's a survival instinct in many ways. And what I mean is, when something happens, one of the first things that we think, whether it's a real fear, a real threat, or something that maybe we perceive to be a threat, so we're anxious, one of your first thoughts should be, what do I need to do? So you get a lot of what-ifers, what if type thoughts. What if this happens? What if that happens? All that is it's somebody trying to predict the future so that they can predict possible negative situations.
Sure.
If I can predict them, maybe I can also predict an outcome or predetermine an outcome based on how I respond. So in some ways, just to recognize or normalize, like, we're kind of hardwired to be this way in a sense. It's a survival instinct.
Yeah.
It's housed in the limbic system and the amygdala. And what we need to know from that is, lizards have that too.
Yeah, exactly.
So
exactly.
It's not a high level function.
Yeah, it's not.
As one who has received the breath of God in us, our soul, what we can do is learn to rise above that. It's not easy because it's so hardwired into every facet of
Tell them about the bear.
experience.
Tell them about the bear.
So I found that this worked with younger kids in counseling, and so I started using it with adults.
Usually if kids can get
Yes,
it.
Hey, why not? But especially I used it for test anxiety. Because test anxiety, all it is the kid goes in and when they, despite having studied for hours upon hours and knowing the information, the teacher puts the piece of paper down and they have a fear-based reaction, an anxious response, and in essence, they start to have a little bit of a panic attack. Well, a panic attack and the fight or flight response are the exact same thing. We call it one or the other based on why it's happening. So if I'm in a room and a grizzly bear walks in, we're going to call that the fight or flight, and I'm going to have a reaction.
Yeah, exactly.
But if I see a photo of a grizzly bear and have the same response, that's a panic attack because it's irrational. So the kid gets the paper put down in front of them, and they start to have that anxious response. Well, to be honest, the fight or flight is it's a beautiful mechanism God made.
Yeah.
It's really incredible when you understand what all the body is doing and why it's doing it. But it is not adapted for a math test.
Yeah, sure.
But one of the things it does is clear your mind so that you can focus solely
Turns on the lights. Turns on the big lights.
on the threat. Well, so they forget everything they studied, and then they start to panic more. So what I taught them was deep breathing exercises to help them manage the actual panic attack itself. And then I would tell them, I want you to take this, put this piece of paper on your desk. When we asked the teacher, she said, sure. And it has your deep breathing exercise on it. But there's a sentence at the top, and it says, look for the grizzly bear. If you don't see one, do your deep breathing. And that's just an example of we need to reorient you to the frontal cortex, the smarter part of your brain.
Sure.
So that the first thing...
That lizards don't have.
Yes, okay.
That's true. I don't know, some
lizards.
But the smarter part of your brain so that you can immediately say, I don't feel okay, but I'm okay. And so I think just people knowing that is hardwired, down to cellular level probably.
Yeah, sure.
That, because people feel a lot of shame over how they respond. We've had people, I'm not supposed to get it the first time? You mean it's normal to not just have faith automatically when you're a Christian?
Not have to practice
Not
it?
have to practice? You're like, no. Does that happen in anything else in life? So I think it's a big deal. It's one that we don't totally understand even through the lens of science. But I think for Christians especially, we don't quite see all of how it can impact.
Let me take one minute just 1 minute to talk about the science part.
Okay.
Because it makes so much sense.
Yeah.
So when we get in a situation, math test, grizzly bear, whatever, the brain is flooded with epinephrine, okay, which is a stimulant. It wakes up the whole brain. It's like turning on the lights in this room, okay? And so it gets the brain ready, okay? But then as we move into the start thinking part, then acetylcholine comes in, which is a spotlight. So instead of the whole brain being there, because if the whole brain stays awake all that time, it wears you out and chronically will burn you out.
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, but then acetylcholine comes in and it helps you spotlight on it's a math test or it's a grizzly bear. Okay. And so it helps me start functioning in a way that I come up now with a plan. Okay. The spotlight causes me out of plan, and then to introduce that plan and stay on that path to get away from the grizzly bear or take the math test, dopamine comes into play, and it keeps me on that path. It keeps rewarding me by I'm making progress getting away from the grizzly bear or I'm taking the math test. So dopamine keeps doing its job to keep me on the path. Then I get out here, I'm indoors, away from the grizzly bear, I finish the math test. Serotonin comes in not only to help us feel better and kind of calm and settled, but it also reinforces that this plan worked and I will do it the next time.
Isn't it amazing how God has established creation?
And that science backs up what Scripture says.
Yeah.
Don't ever be afraid of science. Don't ever be afraid of the fact. To date, as far as I know, and people that I read, no science has ever come up that has substantially said God is wrong.
Well, and I would just add, people who receive that difficult diagnosis or are in crisis, what happens is they get stuck in that process.
Right.
Yes.
So they're repeating the first few steps over and over, not getting to the good ending. And so
Well,
it's very difficult.
And that brings us to our last point, and that is the thing that I always knew with the diagnosis is I had to have a focus on what was the first thing I would do. What would be the first step? Because my grandmother used to say this phrase, well, the best place to start is at the beginning. And I would be like, oh, she is so sarcastic and just a smart aleck. And then the older I got, I realized that that's not where a lot of people start. They start in the middle of the problem. I remember sitting with a congregation family one time, and the little girl was diagnosed with some type of disease that was it was curable, but it was going to be very difficult. And the mother looked over and said, "Oh, you're just going to have such a great testimony to tell one day." And I was like, you know what, woman? She's not thinking about that testimony at all right now. She's thinking about the fact that they said needles and treatment and hair falling out. And so I looked at her and I said, and I thought, I said, what's the first thing that your doctors are telling you need to do? And she said, they've told me that I need to talk to my teachers. And I thought, well, if that's the only thing she does in the next 24 hours, she's done something. It's moved her off of point A to point B.
Right.
Why do you think, first of all, that's important to focus, to be able to focus yourself down? I think you've already answered it in one sense. And why is it so difficult for people to do that in crisis?
I can say from one perspective, again, that of a therapist. I mean, we have evidence, especially in something like depression, but it works the same in crisis. Something called behavioral activation, which is empirically based, and we just know that if you'll get people moving in a direction, positive direction, it has a holistic effect.
Sure.
And so I guess that's maybe a simpler example or answer, but when you stay stagnant, the mind goes nuts.
Sure.
And so I think part of it is having something to focus on. That's why scripture memorization helps. But it gives you something to anchor not just the mind but the body in, because you keep the body busy. You're doing something, whether it's writing a note to teachers, an email, calling the teachers. It just engages you, pulls you away from where Satan probably is waiting for you.
Well, and the sin, there are lots of sins, but the sin is who's going to be God.
Yeah.
And it was back to the garden again, Adam and Eve. Did God really say that? No, you can do that and you'll be fine. So are you going to control being like God, or is God going to control you being like God? And so unfortunately we chose poorly, and the consequences, and we're still having to do that. And the focus helps us get some degree of control back. and that we're able to move in a direction, because if not, we've all been in a place where, we didn't know what direction to go. And that is an extremely out of control, frustrating, anxiety producing situation. But once you get a direction, now you may not be able to make progress out of ignorance. And there's nothing wrong with ignorance. All of us, in particular, all of us face situations where we're ignorant. And so remember, going back to the fact that God, being relational, us creating His image, being relational, need people, then for us to focus on our needs means that generally, out of ignorance, we're going to have to get somebody involved with us.
To your point, something I used to do was we would write down problems one by one, and I would write down what do you have control over, what do you not have control over.
That's right.
And we would segment each one of them, and then I would get them on the part that you have control over, who's somebody you can reach out to to help.
That's right.
So really being specific, because it takes a lot of weight off of it. When I know what I can do and what I can't do, I can just not even think about all that stuff. That's all God's territory.
Well, we had a friend of ours who was an oncologist, Dr. Bellari. And when I came out of heart surgery, I really did have a few weeks there where I was pretty down. I lost my health insurance because I maxed it out. I mean, it was all this stuff. And he had gotten my wife to prompt me every day, okay, what am I going to get up and do today? And my wife, if you know her, is a stickler for that.
No,
you give her a task, and so every day we'd wake up and she'd go, okay, what are we going to be doing today? And so the first visit after a week when we went to see him, he said, well, let me guess what's first on your list. And he said, today it's kill your wife. And I went, well, no, but I've thought about it at this point. And he said, because that's the response I get from most people the first week. It's like, I got to shut the person up who's doing this to me. He says, now by the third week, they've moved down to kill my wife is fourth or fifth on the list. But he said, eventually what happens is you get back to yourself. You get back to your routine. You're not thinking about all these crazy thoughts. You're not thinking about these things that are overwhelming you. And he said, and the day will come, and because I was always asking, so when can I play golf again? When can I play golf again? And I remember when the surgeon told me right before surgery, he said, it's going to be a good 7-8 months before you play golf again. And I remember the day I played golf for the first time after heart surgery thinking, well, that wasn't so bad. I mean, seriously, no, I don't ever want to do it again, but that wasn't so bad. I can do that.
Well, they're usually long days and short months.
Yes.
And that's what, like, I've got folks, relatives starting medical school, and they said, what do you think? Tell me about it. And I said, real long days, short years.
That's parenting, isn't it?
It really is. It goes by just like that. And one of the things we've got with our grandchildren is they'll get frustrated because they can't do something, and I'll say, you can't do it yet. And that's what focus does. Focus helps us focus on the yet.
Yeah.
Because you'll be able to do it, but just not yet.
Well, and I think for anybody who's listening to this, you don't have to have gone through a diagnosis for this to be helpful. Any change, and life is full of change, because that's I don't know if you've looked in the mirror lately, but you don't look the same as you did 25 years ago. You can't do some of the things that you can do 25 years ago, but God has not changed, and the same God who loved you when you were young and spry and healthy, I would tell my folks who were going through diagnosis, is the God who will love you when you feel the worst you've ever felt in the world. And even more importantly, He still considers you part of the family. You don't have to earn anything. Because so many of the people, Ronnie, that would go through this were usually at times in their careers where they felt guilty for having to take the time off. And I would always ask, tell me about your work situation, because I have had to go talk to employers on the behalf of congregation members before and say, I don't care what you do, but you're going to be nice during this time, or I will pray against you that there will be locusts landing on your office headquarters. And because this is important right now, that this person has all this to worry about, they don't need to worry about you. Right. And it was always interesting how God would always put a believer as the boss. Right. And the boss would go, hey, I understand, I get it. I don't think they wanted a preacher praying against them. So, but I used to think to myself, there's this one young woman that comes to mind that I helped through. She went through 3 different breast cancer scares, but is doing real well today. But every time she would get the next scare, she would immediately think to herself, oh my gosh, is this going to be the time? And what she tells in her testimony now is that every time she had the scare, she realized something important about the love of God that she couldn't control.
Right. Wow.
And I think that really is the point of diagnosis is, I come off as being caustic and cynical most times, but I have a pretty good relationship with Jesus.
Yeah,
I know I'm not enough, but I know the one who is. So.
And would you change anything?
I would not change a thing. I would not change a thing that I've gone through in my life because I would not be here today with the understanding and the value I have of things in my life. So I make statements from time to time that are just stupid and emotional, but that's because I'm a stupid, emotional guy. I know the problem with that issue, but I think mostly it's not that. It's the fact that when you're not in control, you're not in control.
That's right.
And that's hard no matter where your level of control rests for anybody.
And you're never find yourself in a situation where you can't do something.
Yes.
And that something really should always be ask God.
There's a great book out there called You Can't Do Everything, But Do Something.
Who wrote that?
A staggeringly handsome young man many, many years ago, but actually begins by saying the one something you can always do is take it to the Lord.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
All right. Thank y'all.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to JourneyWise, a JourneyWise Network production.